Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Ari, and today we're going to have some more stories about our toxic life. But before we start, it would be so much appreciated if you would subscribe to my channel, like the video, if you enjoy it, and maybe leave a comment down below. These simple clicks would mean a lot to the future of this channel and really reward the effort that I put in every day. And now without further ado, let's go. Today's first story. In this story, OP discovers his wife is having an affair with their preacher. Despite initial disbelief, evidence mounts, leading to a confrontation. He ends the marriage, exposes the affair and financial misconduct, causing a church scandal. The fallout includes divorces and community ostracization. A year later, still grappling with embarrassment and avoiding church, he contemplates moving on but remains single for now. Now let's get into the story. I, 29 male, and my ex-wife, 28 female, were married for barely 3 years before I discovered something that scattered our marriage. My wife and I knew each other from college, but only dated 3 years after graduating. One of the things I loved about my wife was that we were like-minded and believed in a simple yet happy life. We were also Christians, and she was more devoted than I was. I didn't see this as a red flag because I came from a devoted Christian home, but I was only a Sunday churchgoer and nothing more. On the other hand, my wife was a worker in the church, and I think she functioned in about 3 different departments. This is just to explain how involved she was with church activities. After 3 years of dating, my wife and I married and started life on a fresh flight. We were so in love with each other, or so I believed, and we had no children. She said something about having kids from age 32, so we could find our feet before we brought babies into the world. I am a very peaceful and quiet person in nature, while my wife was an extrovert. She was the kind of person who literally knew one thing or the other about the neighbors, the people in the church, or whoever she found herself around. So this is to say a couple of people did not really like her because they felt she was overdoing it sometimes. As mentioned earlier, I went to church only on Sundays because my job demanded most of my time during the weekdays. My wife worked with shifts and always had her way of fixing her shifts in her favor, so it wouldn't clash with her church activities. Throughout our marriage, I admired her dedication, and most times, I would tease her and say I'd be like her someday. As a couple, we drove to church together on Sundays and had been doing this for almost 2 years. Our church was small, so everyone knew everyone there, and we were like a big happy family. When we were getting close to the 2nd year of our marriage, I noticed that my wife and our preacher were getting too close, but I didn't think anything was wrong. My mistake. Most times, if he was in our street, he would drop by our house to either say hello or discuss some things with my wife, and each time I asked her about it, she'd either mention something in church or come up with an excuse. In the end, I didn't think about any of the reasons she gave. I only asked, and whatever response I got from her, I wouldn't think about it. Nothing fishy crossed my mind because I trusted my wife so much, and I didn't even nurse the idea that something could be happening between my wife and her preacher. Most times, he dropped by our house, and I'd ask him to wait for my wife to come home, and I'd try my best to take care of him until my wife returned. I did this most of the time because I respected our preacher a lot, and I felt it was bad to have a man of God over and not treat him as one. For once, I never wondered why our preacher was always driving along our street like he claimed and would always drop by my house. It felt natural to me, and I honestly believed our house was not the only house he dropped by. I watched my wife and preacher get close until I got shocking news from his wife. That Sunday, my wife and I went to church as usual, and we enjoyed the sermon in every bit of service. After service, while we exchanged pleasantries as usual, our preacher's wife pulled me from the midst of people and said she had something to tell me in private. When we had our privacy, she told me something that changed the direction of my marriage. She told me my wife was having an affair with her husband, and I thought she was pulling my legs, but it was the truth. According to my preacher's wife, she had been doing some investigations because her husband had been acting differently at home, and after she did some digging, she saw that her husband communicated with my wife the most, and she even found some sensual messages between them. To also be sure of what she found out, she hired someone to follow her husband so she could confirm. and she told me that every Sunday evening, my wife and her husband, they would spend time there for hours before they returned home. Even with everything she said, I didn't believe her because I could vouch that my wife went to work on Sunday evenings. I had dropped her at her place of work a few times, and it didn't make any sense to me. All of my doubts were cleared when she showed me that the preacher had been spending donation money. The same donation money, he psychologically brainwashed people to donate so he could use it for the Lord's work. After hearing enough, I thanked her and got the address of the downtown apartment she talked about. Shortly after that, my wife and I had a long, quiet drive back home, and when she asked if I was good, I told her I had some severe stomach upset. When I got home, I pretended to be sick and waited for her to leave for work that evening. A few minutes after she left, I followed her and watched as she picked up our preacher along the road, and they drove to the apartment together. As soon as she pulled over by the road, they stepped out, and our preacher wrapped his hand around her waist, and they kissed. I was already out of my car because I could no longer stand the sight. I turned on my phone camera before confronting them and recording their shocked faces. I shouted at both of them and caused a scene. I asked them to confess that they were having an affair, but our preacher got really defensive and we struggled. Then he told me I was banned from church. I also told my wife not to bother about coming home, and I drove off angrily. I was heartbroken when I witnessed it, and my wife kept blowing out my phone the whole night. She left multiple voicemails saying she could explain everything and we needed to talk. That night I could not sleep because I thought about all the areas or things I must have failed as a husband for my wife to cheat on me. The next day she came by the house and met her bags packed on the front porch. I told her we were done and she would hear from my lawyer soon. Then I banged the door in her face. Meanwhile, I posted the recording from the night on our church platform, and everyone was shocked and disappointed. With the help of our preacher's wife, I posted the financial records too. This one, in particular, caused many of our church members to stop going to church, and they insisted they would only return after our preacher was replaced with a new preacher. Eventually, I divorced my wife so she could go and be with her lover, and the preacher's wife did the same thing. The town we lived in was small, so the word spread fast, and she was shunned by our community until she went back to her parents' town. This happened about a year ago, and I still have not gotten over it till now. Women just have their ways of doing the most embarrassing things. I had to stop attending church services so the matter could die down. To date, I feel embarrassed whenever I bump into a familiar church member. I may fall in love again, but till then, I'll enjoy my single and peaceful state. Today's second story. In this story, a couple married for 11 years faces turmoil when the husband discovers his wife's infidelity with his former best man. Confrontation leads to divorce. The wife's attempts at reconciliation fail as her father and even her rescuer rebuke her actions. She loses financial support and belongings, ultimately facing the consequences of her cheating, leaving her life in shambles. Now let's get into the story. My wife, 35 female, and I, 38 male, were married for 11 years. Her father and I worked together for even longer than that, which is how my wife and I met. I went to his house for a work party and his daughter was there like a prize to be won. When I started talking to her, we hit it off before I knew she was my boss daughter. I stayed late into the night talking with her until I knew I had to ask her on a date before leaving that night. She accepted. We dated properly without consummating our relationship until we were both clearly serious about each other. Neither of us were talking to other people. Neither of us had those toxic social media accounts, and our families knew we belonged together. It was a beautiful relationship, and I felt like I was living life to the fullest with my loyal, honorable woman. Our wedding was a huge one, wonderful event, and I wasn't nervous at all. I knew how serious she was about me, and I really felt like we were meant to last forever. Fast forward 10 years, her father was forced to sell his business. He made a considerable amount of money from the sale, and since I was laid off, he gave me a large sum of money. It was enough for my wife and I to live off of for years, so I took my time looking for another job. I actually contemplated retirement or starting my own business from home. I had spending all my days at home, I could tell my wife started to get distant and anxious. She wanted to know when I planned on getting out of the house. I asked if there was something she wanted us to do, and she said no. It didn't seem like she wanted to go on a trip with me or get out of the house together. It just seemed like she wanted me to leave for a while. I didn't really get it because we loved each other's company and the house was big enough that for some of the day, we didn't see each other. We each had some alone time, but I also made sure I paid her adequate attention and spoke her love language. One day I was reading in the living room, and I got a naughty image of my wife airdropped to me from her phone. It made my heart race, but not in a good way. Every bit of this felt wrong, like this picture wasn't intended for me. When she entered the room, I just looked at her and showed her the picture on my phone, waiting to gauge her response. She just smiled and played it off like it was intended to be a pleasant surprise for me. I suggested that next time she comes stand in front of me and start stripping. She just smirked and left the room. I made it my personal mission to check her phone at the next opportunity, so while she was cooking and had her back turned, I grabbed it. I found the same picture I saw, except this one was sent to none other than my former best man, the closest friend I had in this world, the man I asked to be in our wedding. I took screenshots of their flirty conversation, which included comments about how I wouldn't leave the house, and they were both desperate to hook up again. My whole world came crumbling down within an hour. I threw her phone at a head-level cabinet beside her, smashing it to bits. She screamed, so I raged, screamed. Her eyes were as big as an owl, and she was as still as one too. I told her she cheated on me, and she was speechless. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew she couldn't deny it either. With her standing there, I sent the screenshots to her father and said I wondered how she was going to get through life without me or her daddy to save her. Her face started to crumble until she was a sobbing heap on the floor. I turned off the stove and told her to start packing her stuff because I was filing for a divorce. She turned so white, her skin looked slightly green. She begged me for forgiveness with all the strength she had left. She grabbed my pants and I pulled away. I told her I didn't deserve this heartbreak and disrespect, and that I wouldn't find it in my next wife, no matter how long she committed to me. Marriage is supposed to be beautiful and blissful, not what she turned ours into. She wailed breathless sobs as I pulled her out onto the porch surrounded by piles of her belongings. She asked me who was coming to get her, and I said I didn't know. That was up to her to figure out. My former best man was married, so it was just 2 hours later that his wife discovered the truth. He was kicked out, and so my wife actually tried to ask him to come get her from my porch, and he cussed her out before blocking her. It was so dramatic and heartbreaking to experience this. I felt like my life became a horrible reality show that I did not relate to. I suddenly despised the woman I loved for so long. She tried calling her father. As soon as he answered, she sounded like a whiny little girl when she called him daddy and tried to paint me as the monster to blame. He scolded her so loudly that I could hear it from the doorway. She tried to interject, but he wouldn't have it. He told her she did not behave like the lady he and her mother raised her to be, and he couldn't fathom how she had the gall and heartlessness to cheat on me. Who an honorable, respectable man that didn't deserve this devastation and betrayal. He ended the phone call after telling her he would not be coming to save her from facing the consequences of her actions. It was a friend that my wife barely considered a friend that came to her rescue and said she could stay in her spare bedroom. My wife had always bragged to this woman about how lucky she was to have me and the house we lived in. Her dad was the one paying for her car, so she only kept that until he told her to take over the payments. She couldn't afford them, so he took the car back. My ex had it all until her actions reduced her to nothing. I can only wish her luck recovering from such a stupid and unnecessary decision that changed our lives forever. Today's third story. In this story, OP meets his wife during college internships, starts dating long distance, and eventually marries. After years of marriage, the wife's behavior changes, staying out late and exhibiting signs of infidelity. He investigates and catches her cheating with a coworker. Confronted with evidence, he files for divorce. The coworker also faces consequences, losing his marriage and getting a DUI. The husband offers support to the coworker's ex-wife and gains custody of their home and child. Now let's get into the story. I, 29 male, met my wife, 30 female, when we were both working as summer interns during college at an ad agency. We hit it off and we started dating. It was a little difficult because we both lived in the same city, but we went to school in different states. When the semesters kicked back up, we decided that we wanted to try long distance. It worked out fine for both of us, and after we graduated, we both moved to the same city and we decided to live together. We got married a year after moving together. Everyone we knew was trying to tell us that it was too soon to get married and that we were being naive by thinking that a year living together was enough time to truly know if we were meant to be. But we ignore all of them. For the first 6 years of our marriage, we didn't have any issues. We were both working hard to make it at our jobs, we started a family, and we bought a house. It was exactly what we both wanted. After several years of being disrespected by her employers and treated like she was dirt, my wife decided that she was going to be leaving her job and pursuing employment elsewhere. In the end, it turned out to be one of the best decisions of her life because she ended up working with some people that respected her, and there was actually room for growth. When she started this new job, a lot of her coworkers were super friendly and invited her to go out with them. They just wanted to get to know her because it was apparently a very close-knit company. She was excited to get to know people that she might consider friends. I didn't think anything of it. In fact, I was very supportive of her going and making friends. It can be very difficult to make new friends as an adult, so it was great that she was. She continued going to these outings once every couple of weeks. They usually did it around payday, and every time they went, somebody else would foot the bill. It was a nice little ritual that my wife was happy to be involved in. About 5 months into her employment, she went out with her friends and didn't come home until the morning. I was worried sick. I didn't know what happened. Normally, if she was going to be out later than 11 p.m., she would text me and tell me. I tried calling her and reaching out to her, but I didn't get any response. Honestly, I was close to calling the police and filing a missing person report. She came home around 5 a.m. and I was still awake because I was too anxious to sleep. She was disheveled and groggy, very clearly hungover. Right away, I confronted her and asked her where she was, telling her that not only did she worry me, but she worried our son too. She apologized and told me that she couldn't argue about it. Apparently, they were celebrating one of her co-workers' birthday, and she had drunk way too much. She ended up crashing at one of her co-workers' houses because they were within walking distance. I could see that she was in a lot of pain, so I didn't push her any further. She apologized and went to lay down. I was extremely annoyed for the rest of the day. I was avoiding her because of my frustration. We talked about it a couple of days later because I was still annoyed, and she told me that she wouldn't let it get out of hand like that again. She actually ended up not going to the outing for a few weeks. She ended up calling me one Friday after work and telling me that some of her coworkers had practically begged her to go. So she asked me if it was all right. I was fine with it as long as she wasn't getting trashed again. Once again, she ended up coming back later than usual. This time she didn't spend the night somewhere else, but she came back around 2 a.m. She was completely drunk when she came in, but I did my duty as a husband, and I made sure she was okay. I gave her some water, I gave her some Advil, and I tucked her into bed. As I was helping her change out of her work clothes, I couldn't help but notice that her shirt was on inside out. On top of that, there was a strong musky cologne scent coming from it. Right away, I was suspicious that something had happened that night. She wasn't in any condition to talk about it, so I asked her about it the following morning. She told me I was crazy and that she would never do anything to risk hurting me or our son, but I couldn't help but wonder why her shirt was inside out. She went out the following week and once again didn't come home until the middle of the night. She was drunk and apologizing to me, which I assumed at the time was because of how drunk she was. Once again, I smelled the same cologne I did last time. That was enough for me. When she passed out, I grabbed her phone and looked through it. I found her work group chat and looked through all of the people, then searched her private chats with them all. I found one for a coworker, let's call him Jim, and she and Jim had apparently kissed. My wife had messaged him and told him that it was just a drunken mistake and it wouldn't happen again. She told him that there was nothing that they needed to worry about as long as it didn't happen anymore. But Jim wanted to go even further. He told her that they had been flirting and he'd been thinking about it for a long time. It was surprisingly easy for my wife to confess that she was also thinking about him. The night before, Jim texted her and asked her if she would go out for drinks. She was hesitant to do so because she worried that they would take a step further in their relationship. Jim said that he wasn't going to pressure her to do anything that she didn't want to, but he just wanted to be around her. She agreed to go, and what happened after that I could only assume was them pushing their relationship to the next level. However, I didn't have any proof that they had intimate. I didn't say anything about it right away because I wanted that proof before I confronted her, and she tried to deny it again. She told me the following Wednesday that she was going to go out on Friday night again. I told her it was fine. That gave me just enough time to hire a babysitter and follow her as she did. She went out to the bar with her colleagues. I could see them through one of the windows while I sat in my car outside. One by one, all of her colleagues were leaving the bar and going home. My wife stayed until she was left with Jim all alone. As the last colleague left, Jim reached over, grabbed her, and kissed her. My wife tossed her arms around his shoulders and really soaked in the embrace. I snapped a couple of pictures of that, but I needed more proof than a kiss. They paid the bill and shortly after hopped into Jim's car. I followed them to a parking lot where they went off in the distance, far away from everyone else. It was clear that they were having intimate in the car. I got the evidence that I needed, but then I was curious about why they didn't just go to Jim's house. I looked him up online and found that he was married with 3 children and his wife was pregnant with their 4th. I felt sick to my stomach. I was disgusted by them both. There was no way that my wife didn't know about his family. It might have been extremely impulsive at the time, but I was furious with them. I called the cops and reported them for being intimate in the car. It was dark out, but it was still clear what was going on in there. They were in public in a parking lot where anybody could walk by. I stayed and watched while a cop car strolled up and pulled them both out of the vehicle to talk to them. They weren't arrested, but the cop did slap them with a fine or ticket for public indecency. I thought it was hilarious. My wife was going to have to explain that to me. I couldn't wait to see what she came up with before I showed her the evidence. I got back home and sent the babysitter away before my wife got there, curious to see what she would tell me about her night. I asked her how it was, and she huffed that she got fined for public indecency. I played dumb and asked about how she got it. She told me that she was walking and the wind blew her skirt up near a cop, and they thought she flashed them. It didn't even make sense. She was too intoxicated to come up with a decent lie. I told her that it was funny. That's what she got charged for when she was having intimate in public. Then I showed her the evidence I found her. She tried to play it off like I was the bad guy for calling the police on her. She told me this would be on her permit record and her life would be impacted. I told her that wasn't my problem and that I was going to be divorcing her. I grabbed my son and drove to my mother's house to stay for the weekend. From when I gathered about Jim, he got the public indecency charge, but since he was so clearly intoxicated, he was also given a DUI. His wife ended up leaving him. I felt really bad for what happened with them, so I reached out to talk to her. I told her that if she ever needed anything or any help with the kids, I would be happy to lend a hand where I could. I won the house in the divorce and my wife was forced to quit her job and leave the city to go stay with her parents while she figured out what else to do.